Thank you for joining us at Accelerate, the Digital Velocity Summit. And welcome to this session, What's Your Data IQ? Leveraging Causality for Data, Revenue Generation, and Your Business Strategy. I'm Dan Newman, Principal Consultant for Team Agility here at AgileThought, and your facilitator for this conversation. It's my pleasure to facilitate the conversation about causality and how to leverage causality to generate meaningful impact in the world. If you have any questions as we go through our time together, ask them in the Q&A feature. Polls, chat, and community are disabled. Question and answer are enabled during this session. As I'm just the facilitator, let me introduce the true stars of the session and experts on today's topic. I'm joined by Eric Sullivan, Senior Vice President of Innovation and Data Strategies from Inovalon, Serap Alvarez, Vice President of Information Services at CMI, and Dr. Jerry Smith, Managing Director of Global Analytics and Data Science at AgileThought. Thank you all for participating in the session. Eric, let's start with you. Inovalon is a public healthcare data and analytics company. Could you provide us with a working definition of causal data and maybe an example?
Sure, and good morning. Thanks. First of all, maybe as a disclaimer, I've spent the last 25 years in healthcare and analytics, the payer provider side. I'm definitely considered a tactical data guy in that time frame. But as a disclaimer, I'm not a statistician or a machine learning coder, so I'll just put that out there to begin with. So Inovalon is one of the largest kind of quality and risk analytic companies in the U.S. for pharma, life sciences, payers, providers. We leverage a lot of big data, and as you can imagine, we're trying to focus on what are the right interventions to improve quality, and what are the right tools to identify diagnosis in medical records, and we spend a lot of time on that with both Inovalon and its companies that it owns, like Alvarez. Unlike randomized control trials, right? We're dealing with real world observational data, and we're in a hit at the beginning. We're here to change the world. We're here to try to improve healthcare, and so we put a lot of effort in understanding what are the underlying causes that are going to impact our interventions and impact the outcomes of a particular medication. And so, kind of causal data, when we think about it, it's not easy to define, right? We're dealing with humans. At the end of the day, this is not the financial sector. So, understanding what are those social determinant variables that are underlying why a certain population will take meds is something we put a lot of focus on. And it's not an easy question, I'll be honest with you, at all, because there's underlying data, training data issues behind this that can maybe or maybe not shine a light on what is actually the cause of why we're seeing what we're seeing, whether it's, again, intervention, a treatment, or a administrative function we're trying to improve, such as reviewing medical records. I'll give you you asked about an example. So from how we think about causal data and causality, our company Alvarez did a good study a couple of years ago looking at the dual eligible population, very complex population. These are Medicare, Medicaid, often very sick, and trying to really land on what are the underlying drivers of why there's difference in quality, outcomes such as med adherence and readmissions. And they put a lot of effort up front on looking at and controlling for these confounding variables, whether it's the clinical history, the demographics, the benefits of those plans, which are very different. And in that study, they which actually ended up helping to change kind of top-down CMS regulations, they found what they called a strong correlation, right? They didn't go as far as saying causality. But another example, though, we work with University of Maryland, and University of Maryland was looking at how AI can help coders extract important clinical insights from medical records, and they were able to define causality in that by looking at the skill sets of the medical reviewers, looking at they actually looked at the time of day and found that the circadian rhythm of the reviewers affected how the AI was used and kind of maximize the value of the AI to help those reviewers find diagnoses and other important clinical terminology. So it's not easy to find causality in our world of observational data. There's kind of there's this flow between just association to pure causality, and so we're always looking at it. But it's a great question, and I think, and I'm sure we'll hit a lot on this today. But we have different parameters that we're trying to focus on and understanding what is driving what we're seeing. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of how we look at it.
No, it does. Thank you. And I think I want to come back in a little bit onto the difference there. You touched on causality versus correlation and kind of teasing that out for sure. So we'll put a pin in that one, and we'll absolutely come back to that one. Serap, CMI is a data-driven consulting and research firm that's developing strategies and innovations that power some of the top Fortune 500 companies. How have you seen causality uncovered? And are there any instances where you've been surprised by the causality that was discovered, much like how Eric was describing the circadian rhythms of some of the people participating were affecting outcomes? That was a bit of a surprise.
Right. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to echo what Eric just said, that understanding and finding causation is a very difficult problem in marketplace, right? So we as a human and as a marketer or brand strategies or part of the brand team, we have a tendency to read pattern when we see two events and two things related to each other, what Eric was just saying about the two things being correlated. We have a tendency to see common sense into it and then make patterns. But you cannot assume causality, cause and effect, unless you prove it, right? And that takes a lot of work, a lot of consideration, like good experimental design and everything else. So, and it's not usually found with just one simple statistical test. You have to have like complicated models and just really, use your common sense plus the real data. So talking about that, one example that comes to my mind is that we were tasked to with one of our pharmaceutical clients, and they were coming up with a new drug in the marketplace for kids that were diagnosed with ADHD, right? It's a very, very, hot topic and, really controversial. So we were tasked to understand if there's like a real interest, what would drive this interest. So, and our hypothesis was knowing from like, pharmaceutical research, like in general, like more knowledgeable patient or caregiver in this case is about a drug and the condition, more likely that they are, or like, not more likely, but their intention to use a, medicine for this, condition is related, right? We know those two things are related, but we don't know what's causing what, right? So, so we had the hypotheses, like, we were out there trying to figure this out. So we created a questionnaire and we used CMI, like, lots of quantitative research in addition to qualitative research. So we did talk to caregivers about, their information seeking behavior, their, how they feel about this condition, how they feel about their child, how they feel about medication in general. So once we started building the model, we took the observed data, we measured it, and then we could not find the relationship between knowledge and interest in using a drug, right? Until we went one step further back, one step prior to it, which was information seeking behavior. Luckily, we had enough sample size, and when we cut the data into two groups, where you get your information was so critical, and it was causing you both in either case. So I'll give you an example. So one group was, getting their information from top medical resources, their healthcare provider or WebMD, things like that. And there was a clearly other group, their top 3 information sources were like mommy blogs against, using drugs for your, young kid, or just, different alternative medicine websites. In either case, caregivers were feeling more knowledgeable, but it was causing, in one case, it was causing optimism. In the other case, like, create like a negativity around the drug. And then once we were able to split the group, we found the cause, like information seeking behavior to knowledge, and then how they related. In one case, there was a strong positive relationship that is just, affecting a drug usage versus, negative way. So once you build this, then we were able to give like a blueprint to our client, right? So it's just, here's like how people make a decision and, what's impacting it, what's causing it. So finding a real trigger, understanding what drives that usage is very important when you're creating a strategy. And I know our client created messaging strategy for their caregivers differently, right? Based on where they go. So, and I think it's very applicable right now as we talk about this strange time with COVID and vaccination. And I see this over and over again, where you get your information, how you feel about something. And it's, it's very important. So I think like that example just always come to my mind, was like one of the surprising things that we have found.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that example. And admittedly, we are in some strange times. And so, Dr. Jerry, at AgileThought, we innovate, build, and run the next generation digital enterprise. And especially in these strange times, why is causality important for companies who are seeking to move to that next generation digital enterprise?
So you know me, I chase the butterflies. You had to say the word strange time to take me off my train of thought. I'll just say this from a cognitive psychology point of view, and I'll move back to the topic. It's strange times because we don't know enough about the behaviors out there. It doesn't mean that, anytime human beings don't know what's going on, it's strange to them. But it doesn't mean that it's not predictable. So just a little thought on that. I don't consider it strange time. I consider it fun times. I don't like people dying, but I do consider it fun. All right, so
we'll set that part aside. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's fun. I mean, that's
Yeah.
half of the battle, half of the challenge that we're doing today is it's helping people understand and unwrap this large ball of yarn, right? It's like grandma's yarn. Where do you start pulling the threads on it, right? And a lot of people get confused and bewildered, and information flow is vast and accelerating, and even today, I mean, what I knew yesterday is far less than what I know today, and I'll give you some examples of that just in the last 24 hours. So why is this important to company? We covered this a couple times. It boils down to a simple statement. Today, we want to change the world, not just observe it, right? For the last 5-10 years in this digital transformation age, companies have been looking for ways to actually bend their business curve, and they're frustrated, right? They've invested time and money into DevOps, MilOps, operations around development and machine learning. They've invested time and energy around marketing and sales, only to see a continuation of the business patterns that took place before. And they're kind of curious on why that's happening. And it's fundamentally because they don't understand the causal nature of the events that they're trying to control. If we go way back to the bottom of all this, one of the questions that we should have started off in the beginning was, well, if we're talking about causal data, what's data, right? I think we take for granted a lot of the terms we use. Everybody knows what data is, don't you? Right? It's ones and zeros, right? It's the bits and debris that are stuck in these database systems out there. If you think of data as ones and zeros, you're missing the purpose of data. And the way I look at it is data is the debris of human activity. It's because of us, not in spite of us. So if we set that as the premise for what data is, and if we think about Eric and Serap's notion that causality is important for that data, what are we trying to get to? We're trying to understand which of those ones and zeros are caused by what applications or encoded by what applications, which are then interacted with what people, right? Because it's because of us, not in spite of us. And once we know that causal data, we can go back to the apps and then go back to the people. And then we can do what? We can then ask the question, how do I change the behavior of Eric or Serap or Dan or Jerry in order to do what? Get the application to pick up what? My behavior change, which then codifies what? The change in data that I need to achieve the outcome that I want. So at the heart of all this, and I think Serap hit it right out of the park, is understanding the nature of human beings and how they behave in order for us to achieve that input. And there's the breakdown, right? That's the breakdown of the digital transformation, right, in that particular space. And if we think about the cycle of life here, I'll spend a little bit of time on that just to put it in context, is, we have this world of data. It's because of us, not in spite of us. We are talking about the causal component, right? Out of 100% of your data, only a small fraction of it, whether it's your enterprise data, your IT data, or as in Inovalon's case, which is a brilliant company, by the way, having all those social determinants of health out there, those non-enterprise, those non-IT factors, figuring out what percent, 5% is causal to chronic health diseases, chronic, for example, if you take a look at chronic kidney disease, right? Of all that data, what's causal for it? What's causal in sepsis, right? In predicting sepsis. So we figure out what's causal, and then we do something very special with that data, right? Most people leave it there, but we actually go off and we develop a predictor, right? Who doesn't develop a predictor these days? We've heard recurrent convolutional neural networks, but when you couple causal data to your predictor, it becomes a very special entity. All right? It becomes a digital surrogate for Dan or Eric or Serap or Jerry, right? It becomes the digital surrogate. Why? Because we know if we change these inputs, the behavior of that changes on an output. And we know we can control these inputs. Why? Because we can go back to the human being and put policies in place. And once we have that digital surrogate, what can we do with it? It's the one thing all companies want to have done, which is figure out of all those inputs, which ones in combination achieve the output that I want, achieve the benefit to the human being that I want at the least amount of time with the least amount of cost, right? That multi-mode optimization process. And we call that prescriptions. It's a doctor prescribing a solution. It's an optimization problem. And then once you do that, once you siphon through all this stuff, whether you use evolutionary computing or particle swarm optimization or quantum computing, once you get through all these cycles and you figure out that's the thing, you take those inputs and you turn to your marketing and your sales and your sociologists and your psychologists, the people that actually touch people in the field, and you say, go put programs out there to cause people to do those things. And then what do? The four of us sit down and we wait. We wait a day, a week, a month. We wait for those behaviors to take place in whatever form. We collect new data, the debris of human activity. We wash, rinse, and repeat. And when you go through that cycle, your business curve bends. You actually achieve the outcomes you want. And this is one of the few cycles that will change if you adhere to it. I mean, it's a closed loop system, which is pretty amazing. I do want to comment that there is a lot of, and that's the basic process, right? I do want to comment on beyond the benefits. A lot of people think it's hard today. We have had some pretty amazing advancements in the last couple of years. Jared, in this world of causality, there are traditional approaches that are done on a statistical basis. And Judea Pearl was basically the godfather of the causal revolution that we've seen underway here. And now we have systems that are capable of doing it, right? We use things called mutual information theory, a bunch of other stuff. But today we can actually identify very complex causal networks. Matter of fact, we did this in a previous webinar for healthcare, where we actually took data from Inovalon and others, and we looked at breast cancer, and we are identifying the actual causal factors for breast cancer using due logic and mutual information theory and all sorts of fancy words that we won't get into today. But there are techniques for doing it, right? Once we get out of the statistical world, out of there. I hope that helps, right? Data is because of us, not in spite of us. We do it because we want to change the world, not observe it. And by coupling this in a closed loop cycle, like I was talking about, you can actually bend your business curve through causal events.
Oh, great, thank you. Eric and Serap, when you were talking, you were sharing, there are some pretty complex things going on from a causality standpoint. Information seeking behavior in one, and the time of day and the environment that people are operating in another, and kind of jumping off what Dr. Jerry was saying about, we found the causality, but then those are very complex things to try to manipulate. It's not just a lever you can say, seek this way and not that way. In fact, because sometimes people push back really hard and burrow more in on their behaviors. How do companies go about finding strategies then to manipulate that causal factor in a way that hopefully, when we come back and observe it a day, a week, or a month later, has improved our results?
Right.
Serap, do you want to start?
Sure. So one thing that comes to mind, like I was just talking about earlier, like creating messaging strategy is one way of doing it, right? So there was this another model that we built recently, is that the preference of a brand was not driven. I mean, it's always driven like price or customer service, whatnot. It was just strictly around like welcoming me, right? So like that's human understanding and psychology. If they don't feel welcome by the brand, they will not prefer it, right? So, but the train does not stop there. You need to understand how your competitors is doing it, right? So how welcoming are they? Is that why their brand share is higher than me, right? And what are you going to do about that? And sometimes we find these negative cause and effect. So because I don't find you welcoming, therefore I will not prefer you, right? So what do? It's a barrier, right? So, but as a marketer or strategies, like, the brand team, like owner of these brand or whatever it may be, service, you need to understand this. You need to understand where you stand against your competitor and take that barrier and turn into point of entry by turning the table around you and be more welcoming, right? So, I mean, that's a very simple way of saying it, but that's why we do lots of research. And, to what Dr. Jerry was saying, there's and, Eric, there's so much big data out there, right? So you can use that data to your advantage. But also, I want to kind of point it out again, traditional statistical way of looking at this and traditional research, there's still so much room for it to understand your consumer, your customer, and then just kind of create strategy around it so you can change the trajectory, whatever you're trying to do. It could be what type of product to build, right? What kind of features to do? How do you change your user interface in a website? And it could be very complicated as using a drug for ADHD, right? So that's kind of how we help our clients to do.
I want to pause here real quick because this goes to the point that you made before, Dan, on how smart these two are. And I think they're so smart that they didn't that I want to make sure that people listening to this understand an important factor that they went through like it was drinking a glass of water, and that is that our teams are missing a couple people today, right? And it's implied in the conversation you just heard, which is we go out and study these things and we look at the differentiators. Well, the two people that's missing on every digital transformation team is a psychologist who says, why does Dan do this kind of thing? Again, behavior results in data. And a sociologist, why do people do these things in groups? And so as Serap's out there studying the impact that a lot of these causal factors have on output, she's bringing those people together. And the common company out there today, right? Whether you're in the financial services or you're in the insurance or you're in the retail, right? You're selling goods. When they do digital transformation, they leave it in the hands of the IT folks. And they're not listening to the Serap and the Erics of the world saying, hey, listen, when you're doing these things, you have to understand the behaviors. And those behaviors, if you don't have those kinds of people on your project, you probably are going to get some IT person, smart as they are, interpreting behaviors in a non-effective way that actually don't result in the programs you need to change the behaviors that create the data you have out there. So that thread in there was just amazing, right? And if you just dissect it and you say, well, how do you do that? What kind of people do you use in that? All of a sudden you're like going, Steve, do we have those kind of people on our project? No, we don't. Well, wonder why we're failing today. It's because you don't have that thought process that Serap just gave you.
So Eric, do you have those kinds of people on your project?
Yeah, no, I'm not a practicing sociologist or psychologist. I think I'd even take it to even more pragmatic position, right? So, COVID was and is still a huge driver out there. And talk about a causal factor, right? So, we launched a really massive telehealth initiative last summer, as many did in the industry, and we were analyzing the success of it, right? We're trying to reach very often very sick folks who are not going out to seek care, and it was really a big driver and certainly a huge concern for our payer and provider, health system clients, and one of the kind of causes we were seeing of why we're not getting as much uptake as we wanted to see. I mean, we all want to see more than we get, I guess, is just the availability of the devices, right? So again, this was a very practical observation. I wouldn't say you need a psychologist, socialist. In that case, it was like you need almost the observational, field rep going around and seeing what's really going on. And we ended up doing a lot of surveys in real time, understanding why certain populations, seniors primarily, were not taking advantage of kind of telehealth services. And we just did a great the telehealth visit last week. 101-year-old. Who had the first visit they've had since March of last year because of this. But what my point is, what we identified, and this is probably like everyone's like, of course, right? But we identified that it was just the availability of the device, the availability of getting a technology, and so we launched a kind of a device-on-demand type strategy to really get folks out there, obviously 6-foot distance and all that, but into the homes to try to address what was this underlying cause of why we were seeing not as many folks accessing telehealth. I mean, it's a very a very real example of, and certainly one that's just such an important one right now, of why, you got to pay attention to, you were looking at different things like demographics and underlying clinical conditions, and it was just something so obvious that, and it didn't take us too long to figure this out, but then the question is, how do then you address it, right? Which is more of the pivoting to the tactical strategy of getting devices out quickly, right? Finding the vendors and the partners to do that, and getting it all wired up, and leveraging our engineering team to help us with that. So I think that was a very real non-clinical example of how you're looking at underlying cause to see why your intervention, in this case the telehealth, wasn't getting as much traction at the time as we were looking to get. Obviously that changed as we started making the devices more available. I would also give I just had a call with a health plan yesterday, if I can, Dan. And we were talking about consumer applications, right? So there's a big push on consumer applications now, and CMS is forcing the whole industry to make healthcare data available to consumers, which is great. Mm-hmm. And this health plan said, that's great, but it's all about third-party applications and smart devices. In good chunks of Maine, there isn't cellular access, and so how do you address that? And so, as we're thinking about strategies, as I think about some Serap's comments, I think about marketing strategies and engaging consumers to access their data. When you look at the underlying causes of why we anticipate we're going to see gaps across the country, is just access to smartphones, access to cellular, communication. So how do you start looking at libraries and places where people can access, so it's kind of that social, the real world life that we live in. This is humans we're talking about, and there's a lot of variables behind the scenes that on paper and in a traditional scientific study may not be thinking about, but when you engage and you start learning kind of the pragmatic approach of learning outside in what's going on in the real world, you start picking up on things that could be influencing what's going on. So again, more practical examples.
That's a great point, and if you don't mind, I want to add to it. So what you found out, Eric, that was something that you can change, right? You can give these people like some access to digital, right? So, but it's like you have a strategy and you can go forward. But there, in some cases, there are things that companies cannot impact. A firm cannot go impact, right? And we have seen this over and over. So we built this model recently, and when I keep saying model, it's just like I keep thinking in my head, which I should be clear that we rely on structural equation models to create like these cause and effect a lot. So in one of these models, like we were trying to understand what drives your how well you are financially, right? And one of the things, like, is a real cause, like how bad you feel about economy right now. Can I do anything about that as a firm? Probably not. Like your feelings about economy with the political scenes changing, there's just so much going on. There is COVID, like there's really not much. But giving, again, like understanding other causes, there's not only one thing that drives a change, like drives an outcome. There are many other things driving an outcome. So then you would try to impact something that you can actually change, like in Eric's case, what they're doing, giving access to digital, right? So that's also very important to understand and point out.
I just want to, I'm not going to argue with the point that there are things that we can't change, but I'd ask folks to think about, don't feel trapped in your own digital box around the things I'll give you an example around a financial firm that suffered from tremendous losses because people didn't repay their credit card bills, right? $2 billion a year in losses, because they would issue a card, people would get a card, they run it up to the max, and several months later they're in default, right? And we looked at that from a causal perspective, and we found several wonderful things. But one of the things, and several things that was in direct control, right? By doing these things, you can actually not only prevent it, but also recover losses that otherwise would be written off after 120 days of debt loss. But one of the things that they found was an area that they thought that they couldn't control, and that is the person's perception of financial solvency, right? When we think about financial health, like we think about physical health, a lot of people aren't educated on that, right? And so the net result is, I know that if I eat these things, that my health gets bad. I know I need to exercise and run. We're raised with that, but financial health is not something that is that common. And we realized that people who had a strong presence and who had a strong understanding of financial health often didn't do this. It was a direct causal factor, and they just kind of threw their hands up. And what we said was, well, let's think about this. maybe as part of the program, when you identify these folks, you educate them, you provide training for them to get a card. And they said, so we're in the business of educating people around financial health. I said, yeah, you could be. And the result of doing that, which is totally not in your digital domain now, would be a decrease in defaults and an increase in repayments and long-term revenue. And when you did the math on the amount that they made versus the cost of educating people to get into this special credit card program they had, it was 10-to-1 return. But the problem was, in the beginning, they just said, we can't control it. So I agree, there are certain things you can't control, right? My classic one is hold your hand out, grab an object like a pencil, hold your hand out and say, gravity doesn't exist, gravity doesn't exist, gravity doesn't exist, and then open your hand. Well, guess what? It exists. We can't control that, right? There's nothing we can do there. But there are other things, if you push the boundaries just a little bit and say, well, what if we could? What would it look like? That may move you into a new digital transformation experience that grows your company, right? It's a fun problem, right? It's a fun problem out there.
Yeah, we outside of us outside of us standing up cellular towers in rural parts of Maine, but that's where you have to start thinking about innovation, right? What are the other approaches? And Serap hit on kind of like, how do you get tactical and innovative around access to care? I mean, there's environmental factors, right? So cellular coverage is a big one. There's the personal, people who are, have a lot of social determinants drivers. So not everything we can control for, but I think the key is understanding what they are, right? And understanding that and decide what you can and can't influence, and that what you can't, to Dr. Jerry's point, is, are the ways you can kind of nudge towards it, right? Maybe you can't change all the factors, but you can start influencing around it to move things in the right direction for your models.
But if you don't start with the premise that Serap was saying, which is putting them into the two categories, right? The things you can control, and the things you can't control, you ask questions about. And eventually, either they're going to cost you way too much, in which case you can't control them, or you just go with them and provide strategies. If you don't do that, you're not in control. That's the whole thing, right? So the funny thing that we're talking about here is expanding your sphere of influence and controllability across a larger domain. Rather than just accepting things, we're now moving into a larger world through these techniques that we now have available to us, which is pretty amazing.
And I think it was Serap, when you were talking, there was a little bit of an aha moment, and if I misattributed it, hopefully I'll forgive me. But it was, when we've been talking, a lot of times I was thinking of a causal thing, and what you were talking about is several causal things, all that might influence in different ways. And so it's not, oh, I found the one lever, and if I throw the lever, it's going to be a change. Is that
right? I mean, that's a great, that you understood it well. So there's of course not one thing causing. So what I think you need to understand, like I always tell my clients, the relativity. What you can do, is that something you can control, to Dr. Jerry's point? Yes, no, check those marks. And how important is it? How much, like 1 unit change in this construct, let's say, how much more unit change is going to have in my, dependent measure? It could be whatever we're looking into, what a customer is doing, right? So in order to you have to understand, can I control or not? You need to understand the importance of it, the relativity. Is it really important, or is it just like really bottom of the list? And I think the third thing that I think a lot of firms miss, how well I'm doing on this thing versus my competitor. If I'm doing really well, there's not a room for improvement. Then why would I spend time, money, energy, everything, try to improve something that has just mid room for me? Where else you can go somewhere that you're really bad at, like welcoming me. I suck at it. Then you need to improve that. Even though that may not have the greatest impact in the overall model, but what you do will create a real impact. Does that make sense?
It does. And you, boy, this is an area we could spend forever on, which is in understanding the impact that it has on your organization, right? And this is one of the few capabilities that if a company brings on, that is causal modeling, this kind of cycle of life kind of thing, that's considered to be asymmetric, right? It's an asymmetric capability. And what we mean by that is that when you apply it, to yourself and then to your domain. If you're a healthcare provider or in the financial banking, financial services, and you apply it to yourself and you learn the causal pieces, and then you use those causal inputs to change, to predict, and then to optimize, and then implement it in the field, and people's behaviors are changed, and then you collect new data and you do that cycle, your business curve changes like this. Well, guess what? What is your, to Serap's, what is your competitor's business curve doing? It's not doing this. Why? Because they're not in that feedback loop. They're not controlling the outcome and then causing the changes to achieve the business benefit and tied in. So what do? They're doing linear. So you get their linear growth, you get your exponential growth, which occurs over time, and you get that asymmetric difference. And that asymmetric warfare, financial warfare, could put either you out of business for not using it, or your company's competitors out of business because they're not using it. It's truly fundamental. And the longer you use this, the more insights you get. And by the way, those insights aren't static. I'll just put a little placeholder here. If you think you can just go and create a model and throw it out there, and 4 years later, it's still the same thing. Remember, human behavior is changing. Wash, rinse, and repeat. So that provides the gap. It's a lot like in sailing, right? At some point, somebody splits tack. Sailboat goes over here, sailboat goes over here. Somebody's betting on better wind. Whoever gets that better wind wins the race, right? And this is one of those few things that once you really get into the causal world is splitting tack like in sailing. And that if you're on that right causal path, it could be game or lights out for those competitors. Really good point.
Yeah, I agree, and Dr. And I think I'll just pile on for a second. The study that University of Maryland study. I mean, the fact that to Serap's point, there was a lot of confounding variables. It wasn't just one; it was multiple, right? Why the AI solution had different outcomes depending on the different reviewers, and for them to hone in on and isolate the circadian rhythm of the reviewers, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that we're going to have all of our staff just work for 2 hours in the morning and go home, and just because that's what they're most effective is this first 3 or 4 hours. But to understand all the confounding variables, what is the impact? As Rob said, like what is one may have a 5%, one may have a 40%, but how do you understand that, balance that, and then build a business strategy around that, and leverage it? So I think the key is really that, right? And it is the rinse and repeat. Just you've got to keep on this, because variables will change over time. They just do. Medical records,
which now takes it out of the research and development, the experiment, the project, and then people like us have to then work with the DevOps and operational folks to say, how do we move it into the enterprise? So we're not using these as experiments, right? And that's really part of the magic too, out of all this. Yeah.
And as you guys are talking, I love we're talking about feedback loops, and a lot of businesses that I encounter anyway, and you can disagree with me, it'll be fine, but they're in big annual planning cycles. And so anything that looks like a fast feedback and responding to change, especially if it moves dollars or human resources policies or your people policies, those can be hard. So what have you seen, or do you recommend for companies who are trying to use this rapidly changing data and causality in experiments when their current cycles are long?
Let me just throw in a measure for folks real quick. There's a, by the way, systems engineering is the lost art, right, in today's world. I mean, it was around 20 years ago. You don't see it in any organization. I just put a plug there. But one of the measures we use is based on what's called the Nyquist frequency. And it's as part of information theory. And the Nyquist theory basically says this: if you love music, we know that we have to sample the music at twice the frequency of the highest range you want to hear. So if you love 10 kilohertz, 15 kilohertz, you want to sample at 30 kilohertz, right? It makes it high fidelity. It goes back to the hi-fi days of the world. That model has moved over to information theory and basically says this: you take the decision model that you have, right? If you make decisions, if you want to make better decisions every month, well, then you have to collect, refactor, and deploy every 2 weeks, right? If you really think your company doesn't change on a yearly basis and you want to go with that, well, then it's every 6 months, right? So, and that encourages people to begin to think about that process. And of course, not all data is updated on that frequency. So sometimes from the bottom up, you find out that my data is updated every week, right? Well, that means if it's updated every week, the best I can do is helping somebody make better decisions on a 2-week cycle. So we have a top-down approach, which is how fast do you want to change your company? Divide that by 2, and we actually have an opportunity to say how fast your system goes. And then the bottom piece is I would go to Inovalon and say, if I'm looking at this data, how often is the one variable that's in my causality chain change? If he says, well, it changes every day, well, guess what? I can make decisions every couple of days. If he says, well, you know what, Jerry, it takes a week to update this stuff, well, then every couple of weeks. So we have a pincher now. And we can provide you with a range in which the best decision making can occur in that space. But that doesn't alleviate changing your organization. That just provides the Deming kind of model top and bottom brackets that we now have available in there.
Yeah. Well, I want to kind of add to Dr. Jerry's, like, you know, I've seen firms like collecting data or buying third-party vendor data, but not really keeping a pulse on it. Right. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Jerry said it really wisely. You cannot build a model every week, not every 4 years either, but you cannot build like really complicated causal model every week and like, you know, keep, you know, trying to figure out something new. You need to build a model that you trust and then keep pulse on your data. I've seen firms sitting on this big data we always talk about, but don't know how to use it. That is the importance of a data scientist, right? And, you know, in addition to psychologists and sociologists, but that's the critical point is keep a pulse on your data and be patient, right? Do you see, if you think increasing one thing, whatever it may be, it's going to increase your outcome, then you need to be patient. You need to keep track of it. You need to keep pulse, and then you need data scientists to dig into your data. So I've seen it over and over again. Some firms don't know what a rich data set they're sitting on, and they don't know how to use it. It just breaks my heart. But I think that's a critical point.
Yeah, and I want to put a plug here for a little bit on Eric's side of the house, because I actually study his data, right, which is brilliant stuff, the data portion of his organization. And I see a lot of people come to the table, coupling on Serap's point, which is they presume a model. Oh, you know what? I'm an expert. I'm an expert in chronic kidney disease. Therefore, I don't need all that data out there. They're in the box. They don't need to change that stuff. And when we looked at Eric's data across, because we do study chronic kidney disease for one of our clients, when we looked across the box, the question is why aren't there a lot of stage 1 folks out there being diagnosed? And Eric will tell you, it's because like 30% of the folks never get tested, right? So if you can get people into stage 1 treatment programs, you increase the quality of life, and the effectiveness of treatment, and also the experience they're going to have in the remaining days as they actually progress through the stages. So the real question then is, are there unusual things out there, right? HL7 data sets, social determinants of health, whether I wear black shoes today or not, that would lead me to believe that this person should be tested because they're not part of the 30%, or they aren't currently being diagnosed to get you into stage 1. There isn't an expert on planet Earth that knows chronic kidney disease that can say there isn't something out there that will point to a person that should be tested, because they're in that box. And it's only when you take their data and use the philosophy that Serap just gave you and apply it that you are actually finding people who are missing out of the programs whose lives can be affected in this particular space. And that's getting out of that box thing and not thinking we have all the answers, and actually saying, I don't know. Let's go study it. It's okay. Let's be Elon Musk, and let's be, you know, all those folks out there and do that work.
I mean, yeah, I think, let me just hit on both points. One is, I mean, I'm a data guy. You cannot overstate the importance of having good data scientists on your team. You just can't. And constantly interrogating the data. And we license a ton of data. We obviously produce and sit on many terabytes of data. But you still need the bright minds to look at it and understand what's going on with it on a constant basis. It's not a once a year. And so going to the other point that Dan, that you asked about the annual cycles, I feel bad for a company that's doing things on the annual cycle, because healthcare is moving way too fast, right? I mean, God, if you had planned on 2020 in January or even December of 2019 and frozen in time, you would have been, you know. So my point is that, you know, we look at Inovalon, we're constantly, I mean, obviously you don't want to completely disrupt the the flow, but we know as an agile shop, we have a quarterly process. But even in intra-quarter, if things come up that we know we need to change for, that's when this is getting into practical, right? You work with your leadership across business and engineering and get it in there, right? As an agile company, you have to be able to pivot and rotate as you learn more things that are important, and not break the whole process, but at the same time, you can't freeze yourself in time and just wait it out. I just refuse. You'll never grow. And to Dr. Jerry's point of going against your competitors, and always you've got to be innovative here and be willing to change.
No, that's wonderful. Well, time has flown, and so I want to thank you all, first of all, for sharing such good thoughts, and give you just a chance for any closing thoughts, and in particular, if somebody's new to this data IQ thing, maybe something you could point them to get started. So let's just let's see. We did Eric, Serap, Jerry on the way in, so let's go back the other way. Dr. Jerry, why don't we start with you?
I'd leave you with 2 quick points under a minute here. For just last week, for the first time ever, we have a brand new study that was released that showed that AI can actually change human behavior. Now, we watch sci-fi shows all the time. We see Jedi mind tricks happen all the time. And so you probably would say, well, that doesn't surprise me. We've never proven it. An AI system actually has influenced people's behavior, intentionally influenced people's behavior, not accidentally through this process. It's an amazing result. It could be also a scary result, right? So if you're in this world of causality, I'd ask you to think about that. And I'd also ask you to begin to think about AI ethics and responsible AI. Just because you can change somebody's behavior doesn't mean you necessarily should change somebody's behavior, right? And we should actually, especially in the healthcare field, right? We struggle with this all the time, and they actually have really good models for ethics. But as we move into AI, causal AI specifically, and actually saying, you know what, we're going to go change human behavior out here, that's when I think our companies need to put up those responsible AI and ethics AI panels to actually ask and answer the question, is this something we should do just because we can do?
Perfect. No, and maybe that'll be another future conversation than the ethics of AI. Serap, how about you?
Well, I just want to point out, because we did talk recently about the data scientist, I would say to someone who's trying to get into this field is knowing AI, knowing all the fancy modeling and machine learning does not mean everything, right? It is a lot. You have to know this. That's a table stake. You need to know when you're going to use random forest or just some randomized effect modeling and how to do selection bias and everything. You need to train yourself. But what you need to be doing is understanding why you're doing what you're doing. What does that mean? What's the business strategy? How is your client or someone who's trying to change the world going to take this data, and what are they going to do with it? I think that's what, in someone, I've seen it over and over, like, if you think you're a data scientist and just, all these techniques, but that's the missing piece. So I would encourage someone to not just study all the, fancy techniques, but also understand business and how people are, brand teams sitting around the table and how they're going to use this information, where they're going to take it. That will be my advice.
Perfect. Thanks. And Eric?
Yes. Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on today. The dialogue, I think we could go on for many hours, I'm sure.
I think so too.
Yes, yeah, this is a great topic. I think that, I would just hit on one point in under 60 seconds too, which is, I think that we at Inovalon and our companies, a lot of it starts with, applied innovation. A lot of the things that we've done, our programs, interventions, and the analytics behind that, and the things that Serap mentioned, often are solve internal problems, and so when you think about a company who isn't really leveraging AI right now, is, what are the opportunities if you could leverage newer technologies to improve things that are pain points internally, that are just that, and so sometimes it start practical, right? And you can learn from that and build from it and start building the rinse and repeat processes that Jerry mentioned and others. I just think that understand your data and try to solve for things that matter. But I think the point that we hit earlier, you can't control for everything, but just understand there's confounding factors, understand the causes behind it. But again, it takes time. It's not easy, but we have to keep doing that. And there's humans behind all of this, right? There's all of us as patients and consumers, and so that makes it ever so complex. So again, thank you for having me on today.
No, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. So in conclusion, again, thank you, Eric, Serap, and Dr. Jerry for sharing your insights. And thank you to the folks who joined for attending this session. What's your data IQ? Leveraging causality for data revenue generation and your business strategy. And hopefully your data IQ is a bit higher than it was when we started, and that we can assign some causality to this session. So have a great rest of the summit.